In the quiet wooded landscape of northern Germany, just 90 kilometers from Berlin, lies the site of what would become one of the Nazi regime's most sinister creations. Ravensbrück concentration camp, nestled against the picturesque Schwedtsee lake near Fürstenberg, represents a unique and often overlooked chapter in Holocaust history. Unlike its infamous counterparts such as Auschwitz or Dachau, Ravensbrück was conceived with a specific purpose: to imprison women. "Hell cannot be so terrible as this place," wrote Corrie ten Boom, a Dutch resistance worker who survived the camp. The camp's construction began in November 1938, following direct orders from Heinrich Himmler, Reichsführer of the SS and chief architect of the concentration camp system. By May 1939, the first prisoners arrived, 867 women transferred from Lichtenberg, an improvised women's facility that had become overcrowded. The name Ravensbrück itself derives from the nearby town of Ravensbrück, meaning Raven's Bridge or Raven's Marsh, an eerily prophetic name for a place that would become synonymous with suffering. The site was chosen partly for its isolation, and partly because the SS could easily acquire the land, which was owned by a financially struggling brick factory. The physical design of Ravensbrück reflected the methodical nature of Nazi oppression. Initial construction featured 16 wooden barracks, administrative buildings, and guard quarters surrounded by a high wall with electrified barbed wire. The camp's layout followed the standard SS blueprint with one crucial difference. It was designed specifically to contain women. This gender-specific design would become increasingly significant as the war progressed and the camp's role expanded within the broader Nazi concentration camp network. A particular feature was the Revier hospital, which would later become the site of medical experiments on Polish women nicknamed rabbits, Kaninchen, as they were treated like laboratory animals. Ravensbrück occupied a strategic position within Hitler's apparatus of terror. Its location was no accident, situated far enough from population centers to maintain secrecy, yet connected to Berlin by railway, allowing for efficient prisoner transport. As the largest women's concentration camp within the Reich, Ravensbrück served as an administrative hub, training ground for female SS guards, and eventually oversaw a network of approximately 40 satellite subcamps. These subcamps, scattered across Germany, provided slave labor to German industries desperate for workers as the war depleted the male workforce. SS Oberaufseherin Johanna Langefeld, appointed as the first chief women's guard, helped establish the camp's brutal regime. Under her direction, female SS guards, Aufseherinnen, were trained in methods of control and punishment. Many of these women would later staff other concentration camps, carrying Ravensbrück's cruel methodologies throughout the expanding camp system. By 1942, Ravensbrück had become not just a detention center, but a significant training facility for the machinery of Holocaust persecution. Interestingly, Langefeld herself was eventually dismissed for being too soft on prisoners, particularly Polish women, and was replaced by the notoriously cruel Maria Mandel. The recruitment of female guards represented a dark intersection of opportunity and ideology. Many early Aufseherinnen came from working-class backgrounds and were attracted by salaries 3 times higher than typical female industrial workers could earn. Some, like Anna Fest, later claimed they had been conscripted through labor offices, while others, including Maria Mandel, who would later become known as the Beast of Auschwitz, enthusiastically volunteered. By 1944, approximately 3,500 women had served as concentration camp guards, with Ravensbrück functioning as their central training facility. After a 4-week training course emphasizing discipline, prisoner control, and Nazi racial ideology, these women were assigned to Ravensbrück or dispatched to other camps with female populations. Many guards were transferred between camps, creating a network of shared brutal practices. Irma Grez, perhaps the most infamous female SS guard, began her career at Ravensbrück before moving to Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen. The training regimen, designed by SS Oberaufseherin Margaret Gallinat, included morning exercises with dogs, afternoon lectures on racial science, and evening sessions watching brutal propaganda films including the eternal Jew. Ruth Closius, later convicted of war crimes, described her training as learning to see prisoners as something less than human, like training a butcher not to feel for the animals. The transformation of ordinary German women into concentration camp guards remains one of the most disturbing aspects of Ravensbrück's legacy. Camp survivor Germaine Tillion later wrote, "What shocked me most was not that monsters existed, but that seemingly normal women could become monstrous through systematic training." This observation was echoed by SS officer Rudolf Hoss, who noted in his memoirs that female guards often exceeded their male counterparts in cruelty, citing guards like Dorothea Binz and Margaret Muse, who became infamous for their sadistic treatment of prisoners. Elfriede Müller, nicknamed the Beast of Ravensbrück, was known to beat prisoners until they lost consciousness, often targeting their faces, a practice that revealed her awareness of the psychological importance of identity and appearance to the women. Hermine Braunsteiner, who would later be deported from the United States as the Stomping Mare, developed signature tortures including kicking women to death with her hobnailed boots. Yet among these brutal figures were occasional anomalies. Elizabeth Marshall secretly provided medicine to sick prisoners, while Anna Seifert warned women before selections. These rare exceptions highlighted the fundamental truth expressed by survivor Odette Sansom. Cruelty was not required, it was chosen. The women who entered Ravensbrück's gates represented a cross-section of Nazi persecution policies. Among the earliest arrivals were German political prisoners, communists, social democrats, and other opponents of the Nazi regime. Olga Benario, a German-Brazilian communist and resistance fighter, was among the first transferred to Ravensbrück in 1939. Her letters, smuggled out of the camp, provide some of the earliest first-hand accounts of conditions there. "We work until our hands bleed," she wrote to her family before her death in the camp's gas chamber in 1942. Another notable political prisoner was Gemma LaGuardia Gluck, sister of New York City Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia, imprisoned as a political hostage and Jewish relative of a prominent American official. As German forces swept across Europe, Ravensbrück's population diversified. Polish women arrived in large numbers after the 1939 invasion, many of them intellectuals or resistance members. Following the occupation of France, members of the French resistance joined their ranks. Among them was Germaine Tillion, an ethnologist and resistance fighter who secretly documented camp conditions and later published Ravensbrück, an eyewitness account of a women's concentration camp. Norwegian, Dutch, Belgian, and other Western European women soon followed. The Red Orchestra spy ring saw several of its female members imprisoned there, including Mildred Harnack, an American-born literature professor and the only American woman executed on direct orders from Hitler. Jewish women, while present from the beginning, initially constituted a minority of prisoners. This changed dramatically after 1942, when Nazi racial policy shifted toward the final solution. By 1944, Jewish women from Hungary, Greece, and other occupied territories were arriving in large transports. Their treatment was particularly brutal, with Jewish prisoners often assigned the most dangerous work details and harshest living conditions. Rose Meth, a Jewish prisoner who survived Ravensbrück, recalled being forced to stand for hours during roll call in freezing weather. If you moved your feet to keep warm, you were beaten. If you fainted, you were beaten. Romani women formed another significant prisoner group, targeted by the Nazi racial hygiene policies as asocials and racially inferior. They faced particular persecution. Many were subjected to forced sterilization as part of the regime's efforts to control reproduction under the guise of racial science. The exact number of Romani victims at Ravensbrück remains difficult to determine, as they were often improperly registered or categorized with other prisoner groups. Elisabeth Guttenberger, a Romani survivor, testified after the war about the particular cruelties inflicted on her people, including the separation of children from mothers and medical experimentation. The Nazi regime's broad definition of asocial enabled them to imprison women for a wide range of perceived social transgressions. Those labeled as promiscuous, lesbians, Habitual criminals, or even single mothers, could find themselves behind Ravensbrück's walls. Jehovah's Witnesses refused to renounce their faith or swear allegiance to Hitler. Women with disabilities arrived as part of the Reich's program to eliminate those deemed unworthy of life. Hilda Zimmermann, imprisoned for her communist activities, later recounted how lesbian prisoners were forced to wear a black triangle and were subjected to particular humiliations by the SS guards. From its initial prisoner population of under 1,000 women, Ravensbrück expanded dramatically as the war progressed. By 1942, the camp held approximately 10,000 prisoners. At its peak, in early 1945, over 50,000 women were crammed into a space designed for a fraction of that number. This severe overcrowding exacerbated already horrific conditions, with multiple prisoners sharing single bunks and disease spreading rapidly through the barracks. One survivor, Charlotte Delbo, a French resistance member, described the overcrowding in her memoir, "None of Us Will Return." "We slept pressed against each other like sardines. If one turned, everyone had to turn." Though originally constructed for women only, by 1941 a small men's camp was established adjacent to the main compound. Initially housing around 300 male prisoners, it expanded to approximately 2,000 men by the war's end. These men primarily worked in construction and camp maintenance. Their presence reflected the Reich's growing need for labor as the war turned against Germany. Among these male prisoners was Josef Pacina, who managed to document camp conditions through hidden drawings that survived the war. Behind the Iron Gate, daily life in Ravensbrück. The gates of Ravensbrück swung open to receive new prisoners regularly throughout its 6-year operation, each arrival marking the beginning of a dehumanizing process designed to strip women of their identity and autonomy. As transport trains screeched to a halt at the nearby Fürstenberg station, women who had endured days of travel in sealed cattle cars, often without food, water, or sanitation, faced their first glimpse of what lay ahead. "We knew nothing," recalled French resistance member Geneviève de Gaulle Antonios, niece of General Charles de Gaulle, upon her arrival in 1944. "We had heard of concentration camps, but the reality was beyond anything we could have imagined." For many, the first shock came at the sight of the camp entrance with its iron gate and the SS motto "Arbeit macht frei," work makes you free, a cruel irony that became immediately apparent. The arrival process followed a calculated routine of degradation. Guards shouting orders in German created immediate confusion among prisoners who didn't speak the language. Women were forced to surrender all personal belongings, photographs, jewelry, religious items, even prosthetic limbs, many of which they would never see again. Michaela Vidlakova, who arrived as a teenager after surviving Theresienstadt, remembered, "Everything that connected us to our former lives disappeared in minutes. We became nothing but numbers." Prisoners watched as guards tossed cherished family photographs and wedding rings into growing piles. One survivor, Irina Perutkova, recalled hiding a tiny photo of her children in her mouth during the entire intake process, swallowing it when necessary and retrieving it later, an act of resistance she credited with maintaining her will to survive. The intake procedure continued with physical examination, often conducted with deliberate humiliation. Women stood exposed before SS doctors and guards, their bodies scrutinized, commented upon, and sometimes photographed. Head shaving, while not universal at Ravensbrück, as it was in some other camps, was frequently used as punishment or imposed on specific groups, particularly those suspected of carrying lice. For many women, this removal of hair represented a profound attack on their femininity and personhood. Polish prisoner Wanda Poltawska described it as, "The moment I stopped seeing myself as a human being in their eyes." Dr. Loulou Lepore, a French doctor imprisoned for resistance activities, documented how women wept more during head shaving than during physical torture, noting, "They took our hair as a final humiliation, knowing it attacked something essential to our identity as women." Unlike Auschwitz, prisoners at Ravensbrück were not typically tattooed. Instead, they received a prisoner number sewn onto triangular cloth badges that indicated their prisoner category: red for political prisoners, green for criminals, black for asocials, purple for Jehovah's Witnesses, and yellow for Jews. These badges, along with the standard uniform, often striped dresses or jackets and skirts in blue and white with wooden clogs, completed the transformation from individual to prisoner. The uniforms, frequently recycled from deceased inmates, rarely fit properly and offered little protection against the harsh Brandenburg winters. Austrian prisoner Rosa Jochmann described receiving a dress still stained with the blood of its previous owner, a woman executed the day before. "I was told to consider myself lucky it wasn't more soiled," she later testified at war crimes trials. Living quarters at Ravensbrück reflected the camp's evolution from a relatively organized facility to a chaotic, overcrowded hell. The barracks, originally designed to hold 250 women, routinely housed 3 to 4 times that number by 1944. The wooden structures, arranged in neat rows when the camp opened in 1939, stood on concrete foundations with minimal insulation. Each barrack contained 3-tiered wooden bunks, a small administrative section for the block elder, usually a prisoner given authority over others, and rudimentary washing facilities that quickly became inadequate as the population swelled. Barracks were designated by numbers, with certain blocks becoming notorious. Block 10 housed punishment cases, while Block 11 became known as the waiting room for death, where seriously ill prisoners were sent. 6 of us shared a space meant for 2, remembered Dutch resistance member Corrie ten Boom. We slept head to foot, unable to turn without coordinating with everyone else. Straw-filled mattresses, often damp and infested with lice and fleas, covered the bare wooden planks that served as beds. A single thin blanket provided the only warmth in barracks, where temperatures dropped well below freezing in winter. The buildings, poorly constructed with gaps in the walls and roofs, let in rain, snow, and bitter wind. Norwegian prisoner Sylvia Salvesen described ice forming on the inside walls during the winter of 1944. "We would wake with our hair frozen to the wooden bunks if we had been sweating from fever during the night." Sanitation facilities proved woefully insufficient. In the early years, each barracks had basic washing troughs and latrines, but as overcrowding intensified, access became severely restricted. By 1944, thousands of women shared a small number of latrines, mere holes over concrete pits, with strictly limited access times. Many prisoners, suffering from dysentery and other digestive ailments, faced the impossible choice between soiling themselves or risking severe punishment for leaving their posts during work hours. French resistance member Germaine Tillion documented how the SS deliberately located the latrines far from the barracks, forcing sick women to walk long distances in freezing conditions. "It was a form of torture disguised as sanitation," she wrote in her meticulous secret notes. Disease spread rapidly under these conditions. Typhus, tuberculosis, dysentery, pneumonia, and skin infections ran rampant through the camp. "The lice were our constant companions," wrote survivor Odette Sansom, who later received the George Cross for her resistance work. "We spent what little free time we had searching for them in our clothes, but it was a losing battle." Medical care provided in the Camp Revier infirmary was minimal and often more dangerous than helpful. Selection for the infirmary frequently meant death, as the sickest prisoners were regularly culled for execution or medical experimentation. Dr. Herta Oberheiser, the only female physician to stand trial at Nuremberg for war crimes, conducted particularly brutal experiments at Ravensbrück, deliberately infecting Polish women known as rabbits with bacteria, glass, and wood fragments to simulate battlefield injuries. The daily routine at Ravensbrück began brutally early. At 4 a.m. in summer and 5 a.m. in winter, guards blew whistles, signaling prisoners to rise immediately. Women had approximately 30 minutes to fold their blankets, dress, and attend to any personal needs before the morning roll call. Those who moved too slowly often faced beatings from block elders or guards. The meager breakfast, typically a small piece of bread and a cup of ersatz coffee made from roasted acorns or grains, had to be consumed quickly, often while standing. Polish survivor Helena Hegier-Rafalska recalled, "Some women would save half their bread ration for later, hiding it in their clothes. Those caught doing this were beaten severely, but hunger made us take such risks daily." The morning appel, roll call, formed the first major ordeal of the day. Regardless of weather conditions, driving rain, snow, or summer heat, prisoners stood in formation for hours while guards counted and recounted. If numbers didn't match records due to deaths overnight or record-keeping errors, the entire camp might stand until the discrepancy was resolved. "We stood in ankle-deep snow for 6 hours one morning," recalled Polish prisoner Karolina Lankoronska, an aristocrat and art historian who documented her experiences. "Several women collapsed and died where they stood, but none of us dared to help them until the count was complete." SS Oberaufseherin Dorothea Binz became infamous for walking her German Shepherd during roll calls, encouraging the dog to attack women who swayed from exhaustion. French prisoner Michel Agnil described Binz as taking visible pleasure in others' suffering. Her face would light up at the sight of blood. Roll call also served as the primary venue for public punishments. Women who violated camp rules, attempting to obtain extra food, failing to maintain spotless barracks, working too slowly, or communicating with prisoners from other blocks, might receive lashes administered by SS guards or be forced to kneel on sharp gravel for hours. Others were sentenced to the Strafblock, punishment barracks, where conditions were even more severe and survival rates dramatically lower. A particularly dreaded punishment was standing at the Strafbock, a special whipping block near the camp entrance where women received up to 25 lashes, with victims' screams deliberately audible throughout the camp as a deterrent to others. Following morning roll call, prisoners marched to their work assignments, which varied widely throughout the camp's history. In the early years, many women worked in camp maintenance, cleaning barracks, working in the kitchens, or tending the SS gardens. Agricultural labor on nearby farms became common, with women working fields under guard supervision. These outdoor assignments, while grueling, were often preferable to indoor alternatives due to slightly better air quality and occasional access to vegetables or fruits that could be smuggled back to starving comrades. Czech prisoner Hanna Huskova described how women on farm detail would hide potatoes in their underwear. "We risked execution to bring back a few raw potatoes, but sharing them with our friends in the evening felt like hosting a feast." As the war progressed and labor needs intensified, work assignments grew more industrial and demanding. The SS established workshops where prisoners produced uniforms, repaired military clothing, and manufactured shoes and leather goods for German troops. The precise, detailed nature of this work, often performed in poorly lit, unventilated rooms, led to significant eye strain and respiratory problems. Mistakes in production could result in accusations of sabotage, punishable by severe beating or execution. In the textile workshop, women mended uniforms still stained with blood and containing bullet holes from the front lines, a psychological torture for those whose husbands and sons were fighting against the Germans. Russian prisoner Nina Ivanova remembered, "Each uniform I stitched, I wondered if the man who wore it had killed someone I loved." The most notorious labor assignment came through the camp's proximity to the Siemens and Halski electronics factory, which established operations adjacent to Ravensbrück in 1942. At its peak, approximately 2,300 women manufactured electrical components for German military equipment, including the guidance systems for V-1 and V-2 rockets. Working with delicate wires and toxic chemicals without protective equipment, many women suffered burns, respiratory damage, and eye injuries. Despite these dangers, Siemens jobs became sought-after positions due to slightly better treatment and the heated factory buildings. Some prisoners engaged in subtle sabotage. Polish electrical engineer Maria Moldenhauer taught others how to create microscopic faults in components that would cause failures only after extended use, beyond quality control detection. "We assembled parts so small we could barely see them," reported Czech prisoner Milena Jasenska, a journalist and friend of Franz Kafka. "Our hands bled from the fine wires and the chemicals burned our skin, but production quotas increased weekly." Prisoners who failed to meet these quotas faced reduced rations or transfer to more dangerous assignments. Jasenska herself died in the camp in 1944, but her letters, smuggled out by released prisoners, provided critical documentation of industrial exploitation at Ravensbrück. Construction work represented the most physically demanding and dangerous labor category. Women assigned to the Strassenbau, road-building commando, broke rocks, moved heavy materials, and built roads regardless of weather conditions. Many collapsed from exhaustion, with SS guards routinely beating those who faltered. Survivor testimonies describe women forced to carry loads of stones weighing up to 50 kilograms, often while wearing wooden clogs that caused painful foot injuries. The notorious SS guard Elfriede Müller, nicknamed the Beast of Ravensbrück, was known to make women carry rocks up and down hills repeatedly as a form of torture disguised as work. Hungarian survivor Eva Kellerman recalled, "The stones cut into our shoulders until they bled, but we knew stopping meant death." The workday typically lasted 10-12 hours, with a brief break for the midday meal, usually watery soup made from turnips or cabbage, occasionally containing small pieces of horse meat or gristle. By 1944, as food supplies diminished throughout Germany, rations had been reduced to starvation levels. The evening meal mirrored breakfast, a small piece of bread, sometimes with a thin spread of margarine or beet jam, and another cup of ersatz coffee. This diet, providing fewer than 700 calories daily for women performing heavy labor, led to widespread malnutrition, amenorrhea, cessation of menstruation, and edema. Dr. Adelaide Houtval, a French psychiatrist imprisoned for protesting the treatment of Jews, documented the progressive stages of starvation she observed. First came constant hunger, then obsessive food thoughts, followed by apathy, and finally, for many, a complete surrender to death. After work assignments ended, prisoners faced another extended roll call, often lasting hours, as guards meticulously counted the day's output and the prisoners themselves. Only after this second appel could women attend to personal needs, washing with limited cold water, attempting to clean clothing, or treating wounds and injuries. The strict lights out policy took effect at 9 p.m., though the actual time available for rest was often much shorter. French resistance member Denise Dufournier described evenings in her memoir, Ravensbrück, the Women's Camp of Death. "Even in our exhaustion, we tried to maintain some semblance of humanity, sharing stories, teaching languages, or simply holding the hands of those nearing death. From scalpel to scaffold, the Ravensbrück medical experiments." In the frigid winter of 1942, a young Polish prisoner named Jadwiga Zajdo lay strapped to an operating table in the makeshift surgical ward of Ravensbrück concentration camp. Without adequate anesthesia, SS doctors carved deep incisions into her leg, deliberately contaminating the wounds with bacteria, glass fragments, and wood splinters. Her agonized screams echoed through the barracks, a sound that would become horrifyingly familiar to the women imprisoned there. Zajdo was one of the rabbits of Ravensbrück, victims of experimental surgeries that epitomized the intersection of Nazi ideology, pseudoscience, and unrestrained cruelty. Years later, Zajdo would pull up her skirt in the Nuremberg courtroom to show the tribunal her permanently disfigured leg, causing several spectators to faint at the sight of this living evidence of atrocity. The medical atrocities at Ravensbrück emerged directly from the Nazi regime's obsession with racial purity and distorted theories of genetic improvement. Since Hitler's rise to power, German medicine had been progressively corrupted, with physicians reimagining their role from healers to biological soldiers tasked with cleansing the German racial body. Medical professionals embraced theories that categorized humans hierarchically, with Aryan Germans at the apex and various inferior groups, Jews, Roma, Slavs, the disabled, deemed either expendable or suitable for exploitation. This ideological framework provided the rationale for transforming concentration camps into laboratories where boundaries of ethical research were not merely crossed, but deliberately obliterated. As Dr. Leo Alexander, a key medical advisor at the Nuremberg trials, later observed, "Science under dictatorship becomes subordinated to the guiding philosophy of the dictatorship." By 1942, as German military casualties mounted on the Eastern Front, the medical experiments at Ravensbrück gained a new justification. SS Reichsarzt, Reich physician, Dr. Ernst Robert Grawitz, proposed studies to test treatments for battlefield wounds, particularly gas gangrene infections that plagued German soldiers. With Heinrich Himmler's authorization, Ravensbrück was designated as a site for surgical experiments to be conducted on healthy Polish women prisoners. Himmler's directive, preserved in SS records, coldly stated that racially inferior subjects should be used, as no German should be subjected to these necessary but painful procedures. Dr. Karl Gebhardt, Himmler's personal physician and a professor of medicine at the University of Berlin, supervised these experiments. Assisted by Dr. Fritz Fischer and the camp's only female physician, Dr. Hertha Oberhäuser, Gebhardt selected 74 Polish women for a series of agonizing procedures. The victims were primarily political prisoners, students, teachers, resistance members, young women whose crime had been patriotic activity in occupied Poland. They ranged in age from 16 to 45, all healthy before selection. Among them was Władysława Karolewska, a 24-year-old scout leader who had been arrested for underground educational activities. During the doctor's trial, she testified about being operated on 6 separate times, each procedure leaving her in excruciating pain for weeks. The experiments themselves were conducted with calculated brutality. Surgical incisions were made in the leg muscles of fully conscious women, then deliberately infected with bacteria, tetanus, glass shards, wood fragments, or rusty nails to simulate battlefield injuries. Some victims had bone segments removed or nerves extracted without adequate anesthesia. The wounds were sometimes left open to intensify infection, while in other cases, experimental sulfonamide drugs were tested as treatments. Many procedures were repeated multiple times on the same woman, causing permanent disfigurement, disability, and excruciating pain. In a particularly horrific instance, Maria Kuzmieszuk had her healthy calf muscle removed and transplanted to her arm, then surgically transferred back weeks later, a procedure with no legitimate medical purpose that left her permanently disabled. The Polish victims rapidly became known throughout the camp as króliki, rabbits, experimental animals in human form. Dr. Oberhäuser was particularly notorious for her callous treatment of these women. According to survivor testimonies, she would coldly observe their suffering, sometimes injecting patients with lethal substances like petroleum or Evipan when they were no longer useful for experimentation. She saw us not as women, not even as animals, but as material, recalled Helena Hegier, one of the survivors. During her trial, Oberhäuser seemed genuinely puzzled by the charges, claiming she had merely followed orders and considered the experiments necessary for German military medicine. When pressed about the victims' suffering, she dismissed it, stating, "They were sentenced to death anyway." Despite their horrific circumstances, the rabbits organized an extraordinary resistance campaign. Understanding the historical significance of documenting these crimes, they worked with other prisoners to record names, procedures, and outcomes. Women from across the camp contributed to this effort. French prisoners smuggled in pencil stubs, while Czech inmates provided scraps of paper. Names of victims were memorized by dozens of women, in case some survived to testify. Polish prisoner Christina Chiz managed to take and preserve secret photographs of the rabbits' mutilated legs, images that would later provide crucial evidence at the Nuremberg doctor's trial. One of the most remarkable figures in this resistance network was Germaine Tillion, a French ethnologist who meticulously documented camp activities, including creating a detailed organizational chart of Ravensbrück's administration that later proved invaluable to prosecutors. Most remarkably, they succeeded in smuggling information about the experiments to the outside world. Messages hidden in laundry sent to the Siemens factory eventually reached Polish resistance networks. By 1944, BBC radio broadcasts were naming the doctors conducting the experiments and warning of future prosecution, a psychological blow to the perpetrators and a lifeline of hope for victims who realized their suffering was known beyond the camp walls. The Polish underground government in exile in London received these reports and formally notified Allied authorities. A particularly daring act occurred when Janina Iwanska, working in the camp office, stole a list of the rabbits' names and had it smuggled out through underground channels, ensuring that these women would not disappear without trace. While the surgical experiments on Polish women represented the most notorious medical atrocities at Ravensbrück, they were not the only ones. The camp also served as a site for forced sterilization procedures, particularly targeting Romani women. These operations aligned with the regime's broader policies aimed at controlling reproduction among those they deemed racially inferior. Unlike the experimental surgeries on Polish prisoners, which at least maintained a pretense of military medical research, the sterilization program was explicitly genocidal in intent. As Robert Ritter, head of the Reich Central Office for Combating the Gypsy Nuisance, stated in a 1940 memorandum, "The aim of our work must be the complete elimination of the so-called Zigeuner gypsy threat." Dr. Karl Klauberg, who conducted mass sterilization experiments primarily at Auschwitz, also worked periodically at Ravensbrück. He tested chemical compounds that could sterilize women quickly and inexpensively without surgery. These chemicals, including formalin solutions, were injected into the uterus without anesthesia, causing immediate agony and long-term damage to reproductive organs, peritonitis, and hemorrhaging. Many victims died from complications, while survivors faced lifelong health issues and the psychological trauma of reproductive loss. Klauberg boasted in a letter to Himmler in 1943 that his method could sterilize 1,000 women in a single day, requiring only one adequately equipped examination room and 10 minutes per subject. Young Romani girls were particularly vulnerable to these procedures. SS records indicate that girls as young as 16 were sterilized, often without being told the nature of the operation they were undergoing. Many learned only years later that they had been rendered permanently infertile. Survivor Czesia Stojka later recalled, "They did not just take our freedom and dignity, they tried to erase our future generations." Elisabeth Guttenberger, another survivor, described being selected with her 16-year-old sister for a small operation in 1943, only to discover decades later that the persistent health problems both suffered were the result of sterilization procedures. She noted bitterly in her testimony, "They killed my children before they could be born." As the war progressed and the Nazi regime increasingly turned to extermination policies, Ravensbrück developed more systematic killing operations. By late 1944, with the camp severely overcrowded, selections for death became routine. A gas chamber was constructed in the nearby youth camp of Uckermark, which had been converted into an execution and selection site for Ravensbrück. Between January and April 1945, thousands of women deemed too weak to work or undesirable were sent to this facility. Survivor Odette Sansom described witnessing women being selected. "They would touch your arm to feel for flesh. If you were too thin, you were marked. If you were Jewish, you were marked. If you were sick, you were marked. The marked ones disappeared." The camp medical staff played central roles in these extermination processes. Doctors performed selections on new arrivals and in the infirmary, designating prisoners for execution with a mere mark on a list. Nurses administered lethal injections of phenol or gasoline to ill patients, actions they later justified as mercy killings or following orders. The camp pharmacist Walter Sontag personally participated in selections and supplied the chemicals used in executions. Even before the gas chamber operation began, the infirmary had become a site of passive killing through deliberate medical neglect, with doctors withholding treatment from certain categories of prisoners. Dr. Percival Treite, the camp's chief physician from 1943 to 1945, later testified that he had received direct orders to reduce the camp population through medical means. The chief architects of Ravensbrück's medical atrocities met varying fates after the war. Dr. Karl Gebhardt, the supervising physician of the surgical experiments, was tried at Nuremberg, found guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity, and executed in June 1948. His final statement showed no remorse, only a defense that he had acted according to the necessity of the time. At his execution, he reportedly laughed at the American chaplain who offered spiritual comfort. Dr. Fritz Fischer, Gebhardt's primary assistant, received a life sentence that was later reduced. He was released in 1954 and resumed practicing medicine in Germany. Behind the Wire, the final days of Ravensbrück and its aftermath. As Soviet artillery rumbled closer to Ravensbrück in early 1945, a frantic effort began behind the camp's walls to eliminate evidence of atrocities committed there. SS personnel burned documents, destroyed buildings, and initiated a series of evacuations designed to empty the camp before Allied forces arrived. On February 2, 1945, Camp Commandant Fritz Sören received orders from Heinrich Himmler to begin transferring prisoners away from the advancing Red Army. This marked the beginning of the camp's final, brutal chapter, the death marches that would claim thousands more lives even as liberation approached. SS Guard Louise Dance later testified that Sören had ordered all camp records moved to Malchow, a sub-camp where most were destroyed by fire. The nearby Lake Schwedtsee became a dumping ground for ashes and bone fragments from the crematorium, as workers frantically attempted to hide the scale of killing operations. The evacuations occurred in waves, with the first groups of prisoners forced to leave in early February, wearing thin camp uniforms and often wooden clogs unsuitable for long marches. Women were driven on foot through the freezing Brandenburg countryside. French survivor Geneviève de Gaulle Antonios, niece of General Charles de Gaulle, later described these marches. Those who could not keep up were shot where they fell. We heard gunfire behind us all day. Columns of prisoners headed northwest toward camps like Bergen-Belsen, Neustadt Glu, and Malchow, often covering 20-40 kilometers per day with minimal food and water. British SOE agent Odette Sansom recalled how one SS guard, nicknamed Blonde Elsa, Elsa Erich, would ride alongside the column on a bicycle, striking women who slowed down with a wooden club. Near the village of Retzau, 16 women who could no longer walk were shot and buried in a shallow grave, discovered weeks later by local farmers. By April, evacuation efforts intensified as the camp administration prepared for complete abandonment. In a desperate move, SS Reichsführer Heinrich Himmler authorized negotiations with the Swedish Red Cross, led by Count Volker Bernadotte, resulting in the release of approximately 7,500 prisoners, primarily Scandinavian, French, and Polish women. These women, including Norwegian resistance fighter Sylvia Salvesen and Danish political prisoner Inger Merete Nordentoft, were transported in the famous white buses to neutral Sweden. For many, this unlikely salvation came after years of suffering, though survivors would later wrestle with guilt over those left behind. Norwegian prisoner Lisa Borsum wrote of crossing the Danish border on a white bus. When we saw the Danish flag flying free, we wept, not just for joy, but for those still behind the wire. The negotiations had complex ethical dimensions. Jewish prisoners were initially excluded from the transports, though Bernadotte later managed to include some, particularly those with Scandinavian connections. On April 27, 1945, the final evacuation began. Approximately 20,000 women were still in the main camp when Commandant Sören ordered most onto the roads. Those too weak to march were left behind, many in the infirmary barracks, where they had been largely abandoned without care. As Sören fled with a group of female prisoners as human shields, including French resistance member Odette Sansom, whom he hoped might testify to his good treatment of prisoners, the SS guards began deserting their posts. Sören chose Sansom because she had received better treatment after he discovered she had been awarded the George Cross. He believed her testimony might save him from execution. In a remarkable twist, Sansom would indeed testify at Sören's trial, but her testimony helped convict him. As the convoy fled toward the American lines, several guards changed into civilian clothes, discarding uniforms in ditches that were later recovered as evidence. In the pre-dawn hours of April 30, 1945, advance units of the Soviet 49th Army reached the camp gates. Lieutenant Ivan Martinushkin, one of the first soldiers to enter Ravensbrück, later recalled, We had seen other camps, but were still unprepared for what we found. Thousands of women barely alive, and many dead who had not been buried. The Soviets discovered approximately 3,000 sick prisoners in the camp, along with the bodies of those killed in the final days. The liberation came too late for many. Hundreds would die in the following weeks, despite medical attention. Anna Stiegler, a German socialist politician who had survived 6 years in the camp, organized the remaining prisoners into a committee to work with Soviet authorities. They created lists of the most severely ill and helped identify SS members who had attempted to hide among the prisoners. Polish doctor Katarzyna Laniewska, herself a prisoner, worked alongside Soviet medical teams despite her own failing health, saving dozens of lives in the chaotic days after liberation. The legal reckoning for Ravensbrück's perpetrators began in 1946. Unlike the Nuremberg trials, which focused on major Nazi leaders, the Ravensbrück proceedings were conducted by the British military court in Hamburg as part of the series of trials addressing specific concentration camps. Between December 1946 and July 1948, 7 separate proceedings examined the crimes committed by camp personnel. These became known as the Hamburg-Ravensbrück trials and represented an important extension of international humanitarian law. Chief Prosecutor Major Stuart Macmillan built cases using pioneering forensic evidence, including exhumed bodies from mass graves near the camp and medical analysis of survivors' injuries. British intelligence officer Vera Atkins played a crucial role in these trials, personally tracking down SS personnel who had participated in the murder of SOE agents imprisoned at Ravensbrück, including Violette Szabo and Denise Bloch. 16 SS officers and camp functionaries, including Commandant Fritz Sören, Deputy Commandant Johann Schwarzhuber, and Chief Guard Dorothea Binz, were sentenced to death and executed. Camp doctors, including Adolf Winkelmann and Rolf Rosenthal, received death sentences for their participation in selections and medical killings. However, many perpetrators received relatively light sentences or escaped justice entirely. Dr. Herta Oberhäuser, convicted for her role in the medical experiments, served only 10 years of her 20-year sentence before being released. Her post-release attempt to re-establish a medical practice in Schleswig-Holstein was only halted when a survivor recognized her and campaigned for her license revocation. Female guard Irma Grez, who had transferred from Ravensbrück to Auschwitz and then Bergen-Belsen, was executed at age 22 after the Belsen trial, maintaining her fanatical Nazi beliefs to the end, reportedly declaring before her hanging, "Schnell," quickly. The testimonies of Ravensbrück survivors continue to resonate decades after liberation. British prisoner Selma van der Peer, who published her memoir, My Name is Selma, at age 98, observed, "I speak because so many cannot. Each story told keeps alive the memory of those who did not return." Similarly, German Jewish survivor Ruth Kluger, whose memoir, Still Alive, became an international bestseller, insisted that remembering Ravensbrück means confronting uncomfortable truths about human behavior under extreme conditions. When asked why she continued to speak about her experiences well into her 90s, Sarah Helm, who documented the camp's history in her definitive book Ravensbrück, Life and Death in Hitler's Concentration Camp for Women, quoted one survivor's powerful reply, "So that my number can become my name again." As we close this journey through the dark chapters of Ravensbrück, remember that between 1939 and 1945, over 130,000 women from more than 40 nations walked through these gates. Though tens of thousands perished here, their stories did not. The last survivor of the Rabbits, Stanislawa Śledziejowska-Osicko, carried her scarred legs as living testimony until her death in 2021, reminding us that history leaves marks that time cannot erase. As Germaine Tillion, the French ethnologist who documented camp life while imprisoned here, powerfully wrote, "Ravensbrück was built by hatred, but its memory is preserved by love, love for those who perished, love for truth, love for a future where such places will exist only in museums." The stones of Ravensbrück still speak if we listen closely enough. In honoring these women's suffering and resistance, we carry forward not just memory, but a sacred obligation to recognize humanity where others sought to destroy it. Thank you for bearing witness with us.